The hand is something that we need to animate. We need to pose out. And yet it is one of the things that I routinely see avoided or not posed very often, especially with students. And there's typically a few different reasons for it. One is, well, hands are complicated. In this one little area, look at how many controls we have. We have 3 controls for every finger, including the thumb. So that's already 15 controls. Plus, you have these other controls in the middle of the hand. So that's another 4. So we're at 19, 20 controls. Plus the hand control right there, 21 controls in this little area right here. Now, as you are working and you're posing your whole character and just trying to get an idea of the shot, trying to pose out 21 controls is like, nah, I'll do it later. I'll figure it out later. No, that's not a good thing to do. The big reason being the hand is pretty much the third most important thing that we look at as humans to understand someone's mood or someone's character. And we don't really realize it, but it does happen. So when we look at someone, usually what we'll do is we'll look at the eyes first. Eyes are number one. This is why the eyes are the window to the soul. They're one of the most important things you'll pose out on a character, and getting good eye shapes and good just eye poses is going to be extremely important to make a shot look real and interesting. Second thing, the face. The face is the next thing we look at. Are the characters smiling? What's their eyebrows doing? We look at the whole face to get an idea of who this character is and what their attitude is. Okay. Third is the hands. We look at the hands to get an idea of what the person is doing. And this is kind of a psychological thing of, you can see the subtext of a character. So if they're going, hello, and their hands are really tight, oh, hi, and they're doing this, well, we can see that maybe they're a little angry. Or if they're really happy, but their hands are just limp, it kind of gives the idea that they're not that interested. If they're holding their hands close, it feels like they're protecting themselves. You can get a lot of subtext from the hands, and we do this without realizing it. It's why when you are taking like business school and stuff like that, some of the things that they teach you is what to do with your hands. So like you've got the scholar's cradle, I believe that's what this is called. When you do this, it makes you look wiser and smarter. When you're in a business meeting, you don't want to cross your arms because it makes you feel, it makes you seem unapproachable, so that you're not open to ideas. You want to keep your hands open. When you see politicians talking, they're always kind of doing this. It's a very strong motion. There's all of this subtext and psychology to hand motion. Hands are so important. Now, as an animator, do we need to know all of this? All of these like specific things? No. All we really need to know, not that that is a bad thing to know, but what we really need to know is that we need to pose the hands. We need to work with these so that we don't get a shot that looks boring and bland. So we need to pose the hands. Now, with that said, once people start posing the hand, I see a lot of common issues that come up with the hand posing. And this usually comes up from 2 basic things. One is misunderstanding the anatomy of the hand and not understanding how it actually works, which means that as you're posing it out, you're doing things that are not anatomically possible or that would break the way the hand should function, which is not a bad thing if you're doing cartoony animation, but still we want to kind of keep it in the realm of realism, something realism, or else the hands are just going to be floppy messes. And the second is not understanding the intricacies of posing, all the different little things we can do with our hands. Hands are more complex than they seem at first, and there's a few simple guidelines we can use to help improve our posing kind of globally. So, to that end, I created a basic checklist of things to do and things to look out for when you're posing hands. So let me bring this in here. So this is my hand posing checklist, as well as the common hand pose problems that I tend to see. Let's make that a little smaller here. Frame that in. Okay. So, and yes, I made this list so that I can send it all to you, so you'll have it on hand. On hand. I didn't mean to do it until I said it. You'll have it available to you so that you can work with it and kind of watch it as you go. Actually, I'll probably move these to the side here so that we can actually read all of it without my camera getting in the way. Okay. So, hand posing checklist. First thing on the list, pose the hand. Honestly, that's going to be the biggest thing. Like I said earlier, the most common issue that I see is that students just don't pose hands. I was the same. I was guilty of this. There's this idea that, I don't need it. I'll do it later. No. Number one, when you get to the hand, you've posed out the rest of the body, or you've posed out the arm, you get to the hand, pose out the hand. It doesn't need to be done perfectly. Even just a placeholder, a rough idea of what the hand will do is good enough, but it should be posed. Number two, again, do it. Just pose the hand. Number three, but I can do the hand later. I'll do it in polishing. No, pose it now. There's so many controls. No, just pose it. That's like, it's just pose the hand. That's the biggest thing. And I know it seems like I'm repeating a lot, but honestly, I see this issue happen so often where people just don't pose hands. You need to pose the hands. Even if it's just temporary, you're going to change it later. Quick little closed hand is going to be so much better than the default flat hands. Flat hands just draw attention to them. Well, it's the reason why the stop sign, when people do this, we pay attention to it. When people do this, we look at it, because that is a very universal sign of, oh, wait, stop, pay attention. So when you have characters who are acting in the scene and they're doing this all the time because their hands haven't been changed, what does that do? It draws our attention to the hands and they're just doing this. No, you don't want that. Even just closing the hands, relaxing them, will make the gestures feel more interesting, more natural. So, pose the hands. There you go. Checklist done. Now, with that, let's actually go to the problems of the hand. The problem of the hand, like I said, is usually a misunderstanding of how things work. And this can be caused by a lot of different things. So this list here specifically is broken into two parts. There's the anatomy portion, where I see a lot of common issues with the anatomy of the hands and the understanding of the anatomy. And then we have the posing portion. I said that weird. The posing portion, which is mostly just understanding the ways we can exaggerate the posing. So let's focus on anatomy first. By far, the most common thing I will tend to see when animating, or when I look at shots, is a broken wrist. And usually it's doing something like this. Now, at first, okay, that's great. I rotated the wrist. What's so bad about that? The wrist cannot rotate like that. When you're posing the hand, and this goes for the fingers as well, but mostly in the wrist, you need to be very aware of what the range of motion of the wrist is. The range of motion of the wrist, let's go full screen for this. Range of motion for the wrist is about 90 degrees forward, 90 degrees back. You can see like that. And then if you go side to side, it's about 45 degrees on the pinky side right there. And then very little on the thumb side. If you actually look at the line of your wrist here to the hand, it's just ever so slightly curved. Just a little bit. It's more straightening than anything. The reason, you've got 2 bones in your wrist. On this side, so you've got 2 bones sticking up there. This side, there's a gap between the bone of the arm and the bone of the wrist, right in there. On this side, it's connected. So you can't bend your wrist that way. The only way you would do that is if you broke your wrist. Literally, you would break the bones to get your hand to move that way. So when we are animating, we need to be aware of that. Be aware of your wrist's range of motion. Now, what does that mean? Well, if I'm rotating this, I can go about there. That'll be fine. I can go there. That'll be good. I'm going side to side. About that, I can always exaggerate. So maybe go a little further. And then thumb side, just like that. Get that nice line in there. You want to be aware of this. Now, there's another reason why this tends to come up very often. This kind of broken wrist syndrome. And that is a misunderstanding of the reference. So when you're looking at reference, there are times where you're going to see the wrist kind of bent this way. And you look at it and go, but wait, look at that bend on the thumb side. There's almost like a 90-degree bend there. Wow, I should rotate that. Again, that's misunderstanding the reference. What's happening is that my hand is actually rotated forward, but the angle makes it look like I'm rotating on the thumb side. So this is where you need to understand a little bit of anatomy and then really pay attention to the angles in your reference. What angle is the arm at? What angle is the hand at? Otherwise, you can fall for these optical illusions, and it creates the feeling that, again, right here, look at how much I'm rotating on the thumb side. I'm not. I'm rotating it forward. So pay attention to that and really watch for that range of motion in the wrist. If you know that the thumb can't rotate too far, you're going to be good. So with that, we've got the broken wrists. Next, flat, boring hands. This is probably the second thing I see most often, and it really just comes down to hands that are just perfectly flat and uninteresting. And this is going to apply to a few different areas down these lists here, but there's a few areas that cause this. The first one is that most people, when they start animating hands, do not understand the palm quite clearly. Normally when we look at the palm, we kind of think, okay, we've got fingers, they bend, they move around, and then the palm is this big flat thing that doesn't really do anything. It's just the thing the finger's attached to. That's not quite right. The palm has bones in it that flex and move, just like the fingers. The fingers, you have the phalanges, the 3 bones in the finger, so top, middle, bottom here. The collection of them, these are the phalanges. Inside your hand, inside your palm, you have the metacarpals, another set of bones. And these bones can flex and move. So, for example, if I do this, see how flat my knuckles are here? I'm trying to flatten out my hand as much as possible. That's not natural. This is actually me flexing to keep it flat. Naturally, look at that curve. So, flat. I'm trying to flatten it. It's still not perfectly flat. Or curved. Look at how much of a curve there is, especially on the pinky side. If you were to do this, bring your pinky and your thumb together, look at that curve. That's an insane amount of curve that's happening right there. And these are in your knuckles, not the fingers, but in the palm itself. The bones in there are flexing and moving. That is insanely important. If you are not using this, your hands will look dead, and I usually use the term rig-like. It's in essence, like, you know how rigs come in at the T-pose? It would be like trying to animate a shot where the character never gets out of their T-pose and they're just acting and moving around like this. It wouldn't look natural. If the hand is always staying flat, that's the T-pose of the hand. And you see this a lot on certain rigs. So for example, this is the Jules rig, this hand. And you'll notice that there's actually a curvature to the fingers here. That's good. By default, there's some curvature. There are other rigs. So for example, this one down here, this is the Malcolm rig. And by default, his hand pose is perfectly flat. See that? How there's no bend whatsoever? That is bad. Now, is it bad that the rig comes in like that? Not at all. That's again like bring the character into a T pose. It's just a default pose. But we want to make sure we change that. So for example, if I want to make this hand pose look more natural, on the Malcolm rig, there's this control right here. I can just rotate that and voila. Suddenly, I'm getting that nice round hand shape and it looks just more natural, more interesting. With Jules, or with the AM rigs, and this is where you just have to explore your rigs, see what controls are available. He has these individual metacarpal controls, which are very nice because I can bring in the pinky just a little bit, maybe the ring finger there. I can even take the middle finger and maybe extend it out just a little bit this way. And look at that curvature now, that extreme curvature, which I could do just by doing this. See how that middle knuckle is standing out compared to the rest, compared to this where it's all flat? Like that. That's a normal hand pose to do. So you have these metacarpal controls. Now, other rigs have what will usually be called a cup control, which is basically right here. If I select this arm control right there, there is cup, which will do the same thing, but kind of use them all globally. If rigs have this, I like this in general because it just creates a nice natural curve and I don't have to use 4 controls to do what one does. This will really depend on the hand pose though. So with the hands, try to avoid the flat knuckles, especially that default rig. If it comes in flat, you want to rotate that and round that out. So use the metacarpals. Stiff thumb. This is one I don't see too often, honestly. It's not super common, but I will see it depending on the rig. Certain rigs, the controls can be a little hidden on the hand, or it doesn't seem quite obvious where they are. Stiff thumbs usually comes from the fact that people will miss one of the thumb controls. So they look at the thumb and go, oh, there's 2 joints. You've got 1, 2, done. So you'll start rotating the thumb like this. And you can get a decent amount of posing, and you'll start to pose it out like that. But that's not correct. The thumb has a 3rd joint down here. It's right at the wrist. Now, technically, your thumb, let's go full screen here again. Your fingers have 3 phalanges, 1, 2, 3, and then the metacarpal down in the hand. Your thumb has 2 phalanges, 1, 2, and then this is the metacarpal of the thumb, right down here. That whole motion there. So, that we don't want to forget about. We need to pose that out. Your thumb doesn't just rotate from the end here. If you try this, try moving your thumb without moving this joint right down here. It's very difficult to do anything without this joint starting to come in. Again, the metacarpal. So, as you're moving the thumb, look for that control. Like I said, sometimes it's kind of hard to find, but it should be in the rig somewhere. So use that. It's going to get you much more natural hand motions and thumb poses. If you don't use it, your thumbs are just going to look broken and weird. So use the thumb metacarpal control. It's going to make things way better. Okay. Fingers feel stiff and boring. So this is another common issue where the fingers are just not that interesting to look at. There we go. So how do we make Fingers less stiff and boring. So we look at them and they're just kind of like, and they pose out and they're not that fun to look at. Well, there's a few different things we can do. The first is keep in mind that knuckles rotate in all 3 axes. So this is actually a very common issue I see with hands. So when we rotate our knuckles, that's these joints here. Technically, all of these are knuckles. So when you look at your hand, we have the knuckles of the palm. This is a knuckle, that's a knuckle. Normally, like in everyday speech, we only consider this to be the knuckles. Right there. So your knuckles, they move in more than just one axis. So when I see students posing their hands, often what I see is they'll take these controls and just take the one rotation. Doop, close it like that. And then that's it. Hands open and close, and you're only using that one attribute. No. Fingers move in all 3 axes. The big one is forward and back, but they rotate and spin on those knuckles. So, for example, as the finger curls in here, and you can try this yourself, we're jumping around here, close your hand. Look at the angle that the finger is, especially the pinky finger. See how that pinky is not out this way? It's not following the outside edge of the hand. It's curled inwards. The index finger, let's kind of curve this, is pointing, to exaggerate, a little in here this way. Very different than the middle finger. In this case, my middle finger here, because I've been writing a lot with it, it's a little crooked compared to that one. But you see how they don't match up. These 2 fingers are like this. They're pointing in towards each other, not parallel. Now, let's look at this hand. See how the pinky finger lines up exactly with the palm? It's just straight rotated. That's not right. The pinky is usually where you see this the most. It should be in this way. Not only that, but the whole joint comes in closer right there. The index finger kind of points in this way. Middle finger, we can straighten that out just a little bit there. And then this one as well will point inwards ever so slightly. So we get just that. We're using all 3 axes to add more curve to the fingers and more of a natural flow. Is it much? Not usually. It's not like you're going to be bending the finger like this. Just doing that looks weird. But there is going to be some change. So for example, let's again go full screen. If I do this, it's the finger here, the index finger, going in and out. And I can do that with all the fingers. So I can do that. That is not just rotating forward. So if I want to do that kind of claw shape, I would bring this up like that, bring this out, and we get something like this. We have that extra ability to rotate, and we're using all 3 rotations. So watch out for that. Do not get into the trap of just moving them in one axis. This is especially true when you're working on a rig that already comes in with flat hands like this. If I just take his hand here, for example, and do the same thing where I rotate it just straight, see how those fingers just stay perfectly straight because the default pose is so straight? You're going to get boring hands here. They are going to be so just generic and bland. So rotate them. Next, the fingers point towards the center of the wrist when bending forward. We kind of covered this a little bit, but a good rule of thumb. It's funny how many of these little sayings all have to do with hands. A good rule to follow is that your fingers will all tend to point right into the center of your palm there. center of the wrist. So if you curl your fingers in, your fingers will typically want to point around there or somewhere more to the thumb side, like right in that range. So if I'm closing the hand, I want to make sure that all the fingers point into that direction. Right in there. So right about that point there. It's just a good little thing to keep in mind. And when you close your hand, you follow that. Even if I do this, so again, if I do this, if you look at the line that each finger creates, it's going there, there. Everything's pointing right around that range. There you go. So no matter what, as soon as you bend your fingers, the fingers, not the thumb can do whatever it wants, should point in towards that region there. So that's going to fix that stiff, boring hand, that just kind of flapping hand. Let's reset this. Okay. Even finger joint rotations. This I see very often, and this usually comes up when people are just trying to get the hand pose done and like don't have to think about it, which is not bad when you're just doing a quick rough pose. But when you're refining the pose or you want to make a better pose, keep in mind that fingers don't rotate evenly. So you don't want to just take all of these finger rotations here and then just rotate them all evenly like this. Hands just don't really work that way. Joints bend at different points and at different angles based on how you move your fingers. So for example, just to kind of show it off here, I can bend my knuckle joint here 90 degrees and my fingers are pretty straight. I can bend my top two joints here about 90 degrees each, but my knuckle joint is straight. There's variations you can do. If you're just closing your hand generally, if you actually look at each joint, like just do this yourself, close your hand and look at each joint, you'll notice that for most people, the middle joint here tends to bend first before any of the others. So you'll have more bend in the middle joint, then less in the end joint, and the knuckles kind of close last. So there's this little bit of an offset to the way they close. Now, again, this really depends on how you close your hand. You could do this. You could curl it in like that. Depending on how you close, there's going to be these variations in each individual joint and how much they rotate. Keep that in mind. If everything is always rotating evenly and perfectly, like each joint is at 90 degrees, each joint is 45 degrees, 30 degrees, whatever. When you animate that, the hands are going to look super robotic and boring. It's just, they're going to move in these just dreary ways. So we want to offset these. And once again, it's just looking at your hand. If you're closing your hand, okay, look at the joints. How much is it rotated? In this case, my index finger is actually not rotated at all. It's pretty much straight with the palm. My next joint is about, I would say, 45 degrees. And then my next joint is what, maybe 10 degrees of bend. Very small. Now, do you need to know the mathematical numbers? No, it's like more bent, less bent. That's really all you need to know. But that's going to make your hand poses so much more natural. So let's just kind of do a quick example here. We want to close that hand. So once again, I will close my hand and, okay, index finger, first joint is actually pretty straight, kind of in line with the palm. So I'm looking at the line of the palm to the finger. Okay. Next joint, about 45. That one, a little less. Okay. Now, the middle finger is going to be a little bit more bent. So something around there. The middle joint is a little, not quite 90. And then this one's a little straighter. Now, once we get to the pinky and the ring finger, the pinky is almost like 90 degrees at the first knuckle joint here. So you can see how they're starting to become this nice offset in the hand. And then this one's going to be a little less. Okay. So already we're starting to get that. But again, we have to keep in mind, fingers move in all three axes. So as the pinky is closing, it's actually going to turn in this way. Index finger is going to turn in. Ring finger turn in. And then the middle joint will actually turn just a little bit as well. I can also close them up a little bit. Right here. And here. And then we use the metacarpals. So you can actually use the individual metacarpals here for this rig. Bring that in. Or in this case, I can use the master metacarpal and just bring that whole thing in just a little bit. There you go. Doesn't that look much more interesting than just boring and straight and even? It's the same pose as the hand closing, but it's just more dynamic. So really watch out for all of these different elements. It's really going to help make your hand pose so much more interesting. And usually the thumb's going to be a little straighter there. There we go. So, voila. Okay. So, even joint rotations. Just when you're posing out quickly, it's okay to just select everything and rotate them together. But then as you progress, really try to offset those. Now, last one is loose wobbly fingers. Now, this is mostly what you'll see in animation, not so much in like an individual pose, but it still does come down to posing. When people start animating regarding the slide here, I'm going to be posting this to the Animation Mentor Discord as well as the Pratt Bros Discord, so all of you guys can have access to this and use kind of as a checklist for your hand poses. So loose wobbly fingers, that usually comes down to over animating the fingers and not understanding the anatomy of the fingers. And like I said, this is more of an animation thing, but it really does come down to posing. So when you're animating your fingers and you're doing something like this, oftentimes I will see students making these really exaggerated like hand poses, or the character is going to be walking and swinging their hands and the fingers are just like swaying in the wind. It's almost like hair. It's just kind of overlapping and swaying, and it's not good. Fingers don't do that. Fingers don't overlap a crazy amount. They're actually pretty stiff. Our wrist, if I do this, see how much my wrist is kind of bouncing around and moving around? That's the wrist overlapping. The fingers, though, if you actually look at the fingers, they're not really moving that much. And if you really pay attention, they're moving in a pattern. So, what is that pattern and what's going on? Well, to kind of understand that, we have to dive into a little bit of anatomy. So, let's look at the anatomy of the hand. So here's the the lower arm and the hand. And if we look at this, we see that there's a lot of muscles in the arm. And then there's a lot of muscles in the palm, all the red. Look at the fingers. The actual fingers and the thumb, specifically the phalanges, right in there. There's not a single muscle in your fingers or the two phalanges of your thumb. All the muscles are in the palm, and that's it. What does that mean? Well, if you think about it, muscles are what cause us to move. If I want to flex my arm, it's the bicep flexing in that pulls my arm in. The tricep back here pulls my arm back. If we have no muscles in our fingers, how do we move our fingers? How can they move if there's no muscle? Fingers move because of tendons. Tendons are attached at the front edge of the fingers, you can see them running right down there, all the way down into our wrist, and along the back of our hand, from the fingertip, all the way down into our wrist again. What actually controls our fingers, and I believe I have right there, is the muscles in the arm. The muscles right in here are actually what control the fingers. You can see the tendons running in and connecting all the way there. Our fingers are on strings, in a sense. They're like puppets. We've got the puppeteer down here, and everything that our finger does is the lower arm just flexing and bringing that tighter here or tighter back there with a lot of cool control. Okay. What does that mean for us as an animator? How does that help us? Well, if there's no muscle that's controlling it, and it's being controlled by tendons, tendons are under tension. You've got one running on the front, one running on the back, which means that the fingers are always kind of held in place by these tendons. Muscles can relax. Muscles can just decompress and just let go, which means that as we are kind of relaxed, everything sags, everything drops. If we start moving around, everything starts to just bounce around and overlap and kind of get this really weird animation, which is great if you're ragdolling your character. Fingers, though, move based on the tendons. Tendons can't relax. They are just there and they get pulled, and that's it. The muscle is what's relaxing. So what this means is that our fingers are controlled by how the tendons run through the hand. And you can all try this yourself. Take your hand, relax it. You'll notice your fingers kind of relax forward here as the weight of the fingers go. But as you bring your hand down, do this. Notice how your fingers don't just droop straight with gravity. They actually straighten. As you bend your hand forward, they get straighter. Okay? As you bend your fingers back, they curl in. Like that. They're curling in. They don't go out this way. This is actually hard to do. If you go like this and then try to straighten your fingers, notice how it's kind of puts a little bit of a strain on your arm right down here. This is actually kind of hard to do and just really hold that pose. Instead, they curl in. Why? Because you have your tendons running on the front and the back. And as you bend your hand forward, the tendons on the back of your hand have to go around the bend. That pulls them straighter, makes them tighter, which opens up your fingers this way. If you go the other way, the tendons on the front of the hand now have to go around the bend, which means that they get tighter and they pull your fingers in. So, as you're animating, if your hand is flopping around, your fingers are not overlapping. They are bending based on what the wrist is doing. As my wrist goes back, they curl in. As my wrist goes forward, they come out. And even if I do that quickly, if you pay attention, you'll see that the fingers are just following that motion. So as I do this, it's not just flopping around. It's extending when my wrist goes forward, coming in when my wrist goes back. Once you know that, you can animate fingers naturally and easily just based on the wrist motion. And this is where it comes really handy when you have a character that, let's say they're unconscious or sleeping. If their hand is kind of, let's say, dragging off of a bed or couch wherever they fell asleep, if they're falling asleep and their arm is forward, you'll want those fingers to drag down, which normally people would do. But if they fell asleep the other way with their hand this way, notice how the fingers curl in. This is the common mistake I'll see where people will make a character unconscious or sleeping and they'll drag the fingers out to drag them. No, they curl in because the wrist is going the other way. So understanding that is very important to how we animate wrist, because if we don't do this, fingers look wrong. They really just do. It's not that interesting. So we really want to pay attention to all of that. So loose wobbly fingers is a misunderstanding of how they're controlled. You want to keep in mind that they're controlled by tendons, and we don't want to overlap them that much. And then when relaxed, fingers will bend in a very specific way based on the bend of the wrist. So yeah, I don't know why I never knew that fingers were only tendons. It's very cool and very weird to think, because we've got so much fine motor control with our fingers. You look at anyone who plays like an instrument, the guitar, the piano, how we have so much dexterity with these fingers, and yet there's no control directly in the finger. All the control comes from here, the muscles in here. Your fingers are not being controlled by the fingers, they're being controlled by the arm. And that's, at least to me, when I first learned that, it's just like, how can we do this? And it made me question, like, how can we actually function in life when our fingers aren't even controlling themselves? Let's see, what does pushing everything away do to the brain, and does that affect behavior? I'm not sure exactly what you mean there. Do you mean exaggerating and how that affects behavior? If you're talking about exaggeration, it's just making things bigger, making things more, making motions, like, let's say, for example, since we're on hands, if you're going to make a fist, make it really a strong fist. If you're going to make a big open hand, really open it up. And it just kind of makes things easier to read. And our toes tendons, yes. So this is another thing. So this kind of goes to the other end, from hands to feet. Feet are very similar. They have a lot of the same principles here in slightly different ways. But in the case of toes, toes are controlled by tendons. You don't have any muscles in your toes. What that means is that if you're animating a shot and your character's toes are just dragging and like overlapping too much, it makes them look like they're broken or they're wearing wet socks. It just doesn't look good, doesn't look interesting. Toes are stiff. If you raise your foot, your toes don't just go blip and drag down. They kind of just stay straight because they're not very long compared to your fingers, and the tendons are keeping them under tension. So unless you are actively pushing your toes down, they just stay kind of flat. So yes, which makes the scene in Empire Strikes Back where they show Luke's hand being controlled in his arm make sense. Exactly. Like they have the wrist open there and they're touching all the controls, and that's what's controlling this. That's exactly it. Those are the tendons, the mechanical tendons that are controlling his fingers. So it's a wonderful bit of anatomy, at least to me. I love that kind of idea of just how our fingers can be so amazingly flexible, and you see people, artists, painters, musicians, like doctors, surgeons, like they're so precise with their fingers and what they can do, and yet there's no muscle in there. It's all the lower arm, which is just really cool. So with that goes through the main anatomy issues that I tend to see with hands, or the misunderstanding of anatomy that I will tend to see with hand poses. From there, let's actually go into some posing issues. Now, a lot of this will also cover some of the things we've covered in the anatomy, but in slightly different ways. So specifically, this is not so much that the anatomy is wrong or the understanding of anatomy is not correct, but the way that we pose out the hands can be better. We can exaggerate, we can push things to be more interesting. So here are some of the most common ones that I tend to see when I'm looking at student work, and once again, that I went through when I was a student. So number one is using basic fist, spread, or pose controls. This is number one, and it's something I typically recommend people avoid as much as they can. So what is this exactly? It is taking your hand control, and most rigs have some sort of like auto control. So for example, here, there's an automatic fist control. If I just take this, aha, I've got a fist. Or a spread control to make his hand open up. Don't use these. Just don't. They're great for just a placeholder if you need something super quick. Other than that, they're just going to lead to counter animation typically, and they make it so that you have generic hand poses. If you pose out all the fingers individually, it takes a little bit more time, but you're going to get something unique, interesting, and that's going to be, it's just going to look better when you animate it. If you're just closing the hand like this the whole time, it's always going to open and close the same way, which is not correct. Now this is actually more of an animation thing, but it's something we have to be aware of. So if I'm using this fist control, notice how the pinky closes first, and then we close that. As it opens up, the index finger opens up first, like so. That's all this will do. Now, is that good? Yes. If you close your hand, you will almost always close your hand pinky first. As an example of this, just try closing your hand index finger first, this way. How does that feel? Does that feel good? Does that feel natural doing that? Closing index finger first? No, it feels wrong. Like, life has just gone in the wrong direction and you're never going to be the same ever again. No, we close pinky first. The only time we'll close index finger first is when we're grabbing something. So we close pinky first. Hey, that's what the rig did. Yay. Now, when we open our hand, if you just kind of keep your hand neutral, your index finger will open up first. Hey, that's what the rig was doing. Great. But there's a catch. This only happens if your hand is resting naturally. Your hand, when it opens up, does not open in one direction. Index finger first and then down to the pinky. What you need is the direction of the hand. So you can try this yourself. Turn your hand thumb side and open it up like that. So towards your thumb, rotate towards your thumb and open up your hand. You'll notice that your index finger opens up first. Okay. Rotate pinky side first and open your hand. See how it opens? It goes pinky side first. You could try the opposite way. Try rotating to the pinky side but open index finger first, and it kind of feels a little weird. Instead, your hand will tend to open up pinky side. This is because of the tendons. As you're rotating your hand, the tendons of the pinky will want to kind of pop open first. So we have a difference. Based on the direction of our hand moving, those fingers change the pattern. If we are using this global control, we are losing all of that, which means our hands will look fake and uninteresting. So I don't like using that. It's not going to help. A master spread control, this is going to go into the next thing that we're going to talk about, but it just makes for boring finger spacing. It's just not interesting, and I'm going to have to counter animate it anyway. So why would I want to use that? It's just going to be more work for me. The only thing I will tend to use is a cup control that controls the metacarpals. Mostly because metacarpals do tend to move kind of together. Not all the time, but in general for most hand closing, because they're all connected by muscle in here in the palm, you're going to get a little bit more of a connected feeling. So I will use a cup control occasionally to get the hand poses. If I do want to use the individual controls though, I will usually zero out the cup control and only use those. So I'm only using one set of controls. So first issue, using basic fist or posing controls. Just don't. Instead, you want to pose the fingers manually. It'll just give better, more interesting results. Okay, next one. Finger spacing. This is probably one of the most common hand posing issues I see. And that is that the finger spacing is too even. So finger spacing is the space between the fingers. Think of it like spacing in animation. Just how, like, when we're creating an animation, we don't want our spacing to be boring and linear. So just that, and then everything perfectly even, like so. We want to make it dynamic. Our fingers are the same way. We want to group the fingers in interesting ways. And if you kind of just look at your hand, this is not super interesting. But if you do something like that, ooh, that looks cool. What about that? We could do the Vulcan salute. Now that's not a natural hand pose to do, but you could still do that, where a character could be gesturing like this. You have this one. This is a very nice, appealing hand pose. It kind of makes things look more fancy, a little bit more graceful, this hand grouping here. But basically, we just want to group our hands and our fingers in a way that looks a little bit more interesting versus everything perfectly even. So always watch the spacing between your fingers. So for example here, it would just be a matter of bring these in together a little bit more, like that. And now we get a hand pose that's just more interesting. It's going to be better. The more even that those fingers become, it just flattens out and kills a hand pose. It just really doesn't look that good. So push the spacing of fingers to create interesting finger groupings. That's really it. Now, kind of tied into that, finger gaps on closed hands and kind of in general. When you're looking at rigs, oftentimes when you're trying to group fingers together, let's say we've got to fix that boring finger spacing. Let's bring those fingers together. Great. So we bring these together and we get a gap in the fingers here. That's not right. If you look at your fingers and you bring them closer together, there's no gap. They press up against each other. You might have a little tiny gap if you look really closely, like right next to the knuckle, but no, fingers press against each other. We don't have a big gap, and especially most people, it really depends on how straight your fingers are. You're not going to have a gap in the middle if your fingertips are touching. So why do we have that here? Let's try another finger. So we'll raise this and bring this in. So we'll get that pinky to press it right up against the index finger, and well, unless we break it and push it so that it stabs into the other finger, we've still got that gap. And the same thing happens when you close the hand. So let's close the hand here. When we start trying to position these, you'll notice that unless I start cutting the fingers into each other, we're starting to get gaps in the knuckle area. Again, do a fist. Look at your knuckles. Do you see any gaps there? No. Why does this happen? We're not using the metacarpals. The metacarpals are what's going to allow us to compress these together. When we're doing a fist and when we're opening these up, we don't notice it, but our metacarpals are moving in the hand. So you just want to bring that in. So if I'm making a fist here, boop, there we go. Now we get that nice pressed feeling in the hand and everything feels nice and tight. Let's undo this right there. Get back to our middle finger grouping here, just because I like that one. And look at how much I have to move that ring finger to get this kind of in place, and notice the gap that we're creating. No, take your metacarpal, move that in, no gap. Now it's nice and pressed in, and you're good. You're not moving the metacarpals a ton. You're not using that to just twist the finger all the way around, but that will get you that nice, interesting silhouette and nice compressed finger poses. You need those metacarpals. These are the most forgotten controls. Like we talk about clavicles, we talk about a lot of other controls that get forgotten. The metacarpals are a huge one that just get left behind a lot of the time. And they are the ones that are going to really make your hand poses shine. Okay, so finger gaps. You can close the gap by using the metacarpal control. There you go. Flat finger and knuckle arcs. So we covered this a little bit already. Earlier we were talking about how we want to avoid flat, boring hands. Well, this is a extension of that, but it applies to more of the whole pose versus just the knuckles. When you're posing out hands, one thing you want to avoid is, let's say we're going to just start bending the fingers forward here. What we want to avoid is the feeling that all the fingers line up in a straight, boring line. And this is especially true from your shot camera. So for example, let's say this is our shot camera and we're posing out our fingers and we get this. If you look at the line of the fingers, look at your fingertips. There, 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 there. See how it just creates this perfectly flat line? That's boring. That's uninteresting. Just like in animation, how we want to put arcs into things, fingers will usually have an arc to them. That makes them more appealing. So if I see this type of pose, I want to add an arc. I look at those fingertips and maybe I'll just rotate these up a little bit here. Now if we look at those fingertips, it creates an arc. Maybe I'll even bend this one in a little bit more, exaggerate that arc of the fingers. This applies not just to the fingertips, but to the individual knuckles of the hand and the knuckles of the fingers as well. Whenever I'm posing a hand, if I see the pose and let's say with this one, maybe we're posing it out and we get this. See how the knuckles feel just kind of flat and boring? Put an arc to it. Does it start to curve? Okay, perfect. The fingers, they look like they're curving as well. You want to avoid these flat lines. Just draw a line from all the fingertips or the knuckles, one knuckle to the next. If it's creating a flat line, curve it. And you see this in real life. So if I pose out my hand, see how there's an arc to those fingers? If you just look at the fingertips, we get that kind of curve. If I do this, there's an arc just because the fingers are different lengths. If I do this, that's a little flat. That would be kind of boring. So I would push it a little bit more like this. Now there's an arc. Now it's more interesting. Watch your fingertips. Watch your knuckles. All of these. If you're starting to feel this to be just like perfectly flat, try to push an arc into it. So maybe something like that, or even something like this. Now it's kind of the opposite arc. It's going to make your hand poses just more appealing in general. Just like how animation, things look better with arcs. So if you're getting a flat finger or knuckle arc, just draw a line along the knuckles, along the fingertips. If the line is straight, try curving it to get a better pose. Okay, now this is one I see quite often when people, like the very first time they pose out hands, a lot of people fall into this, where the index finger is lower than the rest of the fingers. So it's this pose here. Doing that. That's not necessarily a bad pose. Honestly, we do that quite often, especially if I'm going to push a button. We'll do that. Or if I'm kind of pointing down at something, I might do that. But it's actually not a pose that we do very often. If you actually relax your hand, your index finger tends to stay straighter than the rest. So as we're moving our hands, our index finger tends to stay higher than the rest of the fingers unless we're doing something like this. If I'm twisting my hand to the pinky side, that's when my index finger will drop. Other than that, my index finger tends to stay higher, especially if I twist my hand to the thumb side. You're going to get that much higher positioning. So just be careful of that. If you're posing your character and they're always doing this, where their index finger is always lower, it's just going to look weird. So that's a very basic one, but I see it quite often. So the index finger typically rests higher than the other fingers. No sympathetic motion poses, like points. Now this is a big one. And this is going to be what really helps make your posing feel more interesting. So let's do a point, a character pointing. A point is one of the poses that you typically want to avoid in animation because it's a little cliche and doesn't really, it's not always that interesting. But let's say we have to animate a point. A character is pointing. These poses are some of the easiest to make look absolutely dead and uninteresting. I've seen so many shots where a point is just meh, is bleh. There's nothing interesting about it. It's just this, like that. See how that just doesn't look interesting? It's so boring. And when you have a character pointing, and especially when they're doing a big scene like this, and this is all you get, it's this like nub with a stick at the end of it. It doesn't look good. It's just not good. So why doesn't it look good? Well, the big one is that you're missing the sympathetic action. So what do I mean by sympathetic action? Take your hands and try to move a finger without the others. So try to move your pinky finger down and see if you can move it without your ring finger moving. You're not. In this case, these two fingers share a tendon. So if you bring one finger down, they're going to affect each other. If you bring down your middle finger, notice how everything else gets affected too. Especially the lower you go, the more they get pulled. If you go into a point like this, right now I'm holding my middle finger down with my thumb. I'm pushing it down. If I don't do this and I do a point, look at my middle finger. It's not flat. If I do a fist, I can get that flat there. As I point, look at that middle finger. It comes up. Because you're stretching, and especially if you do a very powerful point, your middle finger has some sympathetic motion to it. It wants to work with the hand to create this. So you get this very specific silhouette, which is actually a more interesting silhouette because it creates a line that points to the finger versus being flat and then just a 90-degree bend. So if you want to make an interesting point, get that sympathetic action in there. So I'm going to bring this up here. Let's tighten this finger up just a little bit more right there. And then a little bit more here as well. And then don't forget your other rotations. Like so. Don't forget your metacarpals. Push that all in. Tighten that up. So we get something like this. Now I'm exaggerating this a little bit, probably bring that down just a little bit more. Something like that. Suddenly, that's more interesting to look at. The line of the hand is going up to the finger, and even the finger needs to be rotated this way so the fingernail isn't just perfectly in line. Now we get an interesting point. You need to think of your sympathetic action. If one of the fingers are going to do something, it's going to affect some of the other fingers. Maybe not all of them, but at least one of the other fingers. Now, if it's just a tiny little motion, okay, maybe not too much, but there's usually going to be some sort of reflex or connection. So think of your sympathetic action. Now, with that, so yeah, fingers all have some degree of sympathetic action. The next one that I tend to see is the fist nub, which kind of falls into the same category here, is when people are creating fists, a very common issue, I'm going to do this super quick, is the fist nub silhouette, which is just not interesting to look at. That. So I will see a lot of shots where people are fighting and the hands are just this, like these little nubbins. And you can see when I do this, this doesn't look imposing. It doesn't look interesting. It just looks like I've got little nubs at the end of my hands that are like soft and squishy. That doesn't make an interesting fist pose. It doesn't make an interesting fighting pose. It's just boring. So how do you make an interesting fist? Well, you just show some of the fingers and the knuckles. So instead of going like this, show some of the fingers. The index finger comes out a little bit, creates this little bit of a slope, makes it a little bit more interesting to look at. Show the metacarpal knuckle of the thumb, like that. Suddenly, you get this dynamic shape to the hand, and it makes it look sharper and pointier because we're seeing these bends, which makes it feel more powerful than a soft little nub. So you just do that. So in the case of this hand, I would just bring that out a little bit. So already that's going to help. And then just a little bit of the joints here. Something like that. So even just that, suddenly this hand looks a little bit more three-dimensional, more interesting. And then ideally what you should also be doing is trying to put the hand at a little bit of a 3/4 so that you're not just seeing the straight back of it, but some sort of dimensionality. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Avoid the fist nub. And then the last one, and this is something I see quite often when people are animating fight scenes, is the broken thumb style fighting, which would be a very terrible fighting style to learn, and I highly recommend you don't do it. And basically this is as you're closing your fist and you go in for a fight, I see a lot of people do this, where they put the thumb in and then curl the fingers around as they're getting ready for a fight. No. Unless your character really doesn't know how to fight, and you want to emphasize that, you will never fight like this. The reason being, if you do that, you're going to break your own thumb. Because as you put your fingers over here and you hit something, the pressure is going to push down on your fingers, which will then push down on your thumb and it'll pop the knuckle right there. You'll either break your finger or dislocate it. Instead, thumb goes on the outside. So a very simple one. It's honestly, I'm not even going to show it on the screen there, but yeah, put your thumb on the outside. It's better for fighting. If you're animating a fighting scene, really pay attention to that. In general, study how people fight. Look at the postures and everything. It'll help make your shots look better and avoid these kind of weird situations. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So those are the main areas that I tend to see with kind of a hand posing. So let's actually make that all visible here. Okay. So there we go. So this is the whole list. The posing checklist, honestly, like this was just more in fun, but the big posing checklist is just make sure you pose the hand. And then after that, just watch out for these common problems, especially the ones in anatomy. If you understand the anatomy, everything else kind of falls into place. So for example, as soon as you start understanding metacarpals, that's going to avoid the boring finger spacing, the finger gaps, the flat knuckles and arcs. All of this comes down to the metacarpals and then by extension into the fingers. And as long as you understand those, you're going to get so much more appealing. Your animation in your hands is going to look so much better. Your posing is going to be so much better. So really pay attention to these notes. And yeah, hopefully that was helpful. How can you create tension when you are, for example, holding something very hard? I meant, how do you show that tension and force? You use the metacarpals. So if I'm holding something loose, see how my fingers are flat, but as soon as I add tension, look at what's happening to those knuckles. They're rounding out. So if you're just bending your fingers, you're not going to add tension. You can like really strain that, and I'm trying to push it as much as I can here, but it always looks a little flat. The moment you add those metacarpals in there and you round that out, that adds that tension. All the muscles in the hand are curling in. So that's going to help a lot there. And then in terms of force, it's also going to be the bend of the fingers. How much of a separation. So if I'm holding something really tight, my hand might be a little bit more in this pose as it's straining against my fingers, especially like I'm pulling on a rope and there's tension in there. My fingers aren't just going to be closed straight. They're going to be a little bit more like that.